On. You guys got me? Okay. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to CORES, the cause of and solution to all of your SBA problems. Now, this picture obviously doesn't say SBA because I'm no good at Photoshop, right? And Dave Corsi wasn't available to fix it for me because he's my token Photoshop guy. But in reality, SBA was just used because it was short, but really it's kind of like the cause of and solution to your microservices problem, your XHR problem, your SBA problems. Anybody that's done client-side development, it's been at some point in time the bane of your existence, okay? And so while it applies to a whole lot of things, CORES really is the cause of and solution to those types of problems. Now, as we move through the talk, when we get to the end, I'm going to do a demo, and this is probably the most complex demo anybody's ever tried to do on stage, because we all know how demos tend to fail miserably. Well, we're using 3 different cloud platforms, and nothing works unless you participate, okay? So with all these different moving pieces all trying to work together over a hotel internet connection, this ought to be super interesting to see it go down. It's worked before. And I do have a video as backup, but I'd really like to see this happen live. But regardless, if you've got a computer or you got a phone and you want to participate, then what I would ask you to do is go ahead and have it out and ready, because toward the end of the talk, I'm going to show you a link to go to, and that'll be how you participate in that particular exercise. Just wanted to give you a heads up on that right now. So some goals and objectives for the talk. You are here, right, at the beginning of this little outline here. Kevin and I will briefly introduce ourselves. Then Kevin will talk about some of the web applications in 2019. State of them. I'm going to go in and talk a little bit about same origin policy, which gives me the opportunity to introduce what is called cross-origin resource sharing, right, the main event of this particular talk. Then Kevin will dive into some common security concerns with CORES, and then I'm going to introduce to you the CORES exploitation framework, which is where you folks get involved, and then we'll share some final thoughts and move on from that. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Tim Tomes. I'm also known as Landmaster 53 in some circles, and there's a whole lot of bunch of stuff on the slide. Feel free to go ahead and read through it, but the only thing up here that really matters is that I do it all for my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, okay? I'm going to hand it over to Kevin now.
Yeah, so I'm Kevin Cody, at Kev Cody on Twitter. I'm from Pittsburgh. My day job is that I get to hack on autonomous vehicles or around autonomous vehicles sometimes. I'm a bit of a vulnerability stumble upon. If anyone has worked with me in the past, they know I just like fall butt first into stuff all the time. I'm not a Tavis Ormany type. Like I'm not gonna, tear something apart and know down to the line of code exactly the cause and understand the entire architecture, all that stuff. Rather, I just find stuff constantly. You just fall flat ass first into stuff, and I'm constantly having a lot of fun, and it's pretty cool to be in a career that just lets me hack away on stuff and find problems all the time. I also do OWASP Pittsburgh. I am a husband, dad, hacker, lockpicker, fix stuff on YouTube, fisherman, and I have a little bit of ADD. So when we talk about the state of web apps in 2019, things are pretty different from a decade ago or even 20 years ago if you were doing web 20 years ago. Today's apps are, of course, really rich in single-page apps, right? JavaScript heavy, client-side heavy. Sometimes we don't even have servers at all. Now, I'm not talking about serverless. I'm talking about actual thick client apps or browser apps that don't even communicate outside of your browser, right? They're just all local clients, and that's all done using JavaScript. It's pretty amazing. Also, when we talk about web apps in 2019, we would be amiss if we didn't talk about WebSockets or one-offs from WebSockets like long polling, Comet D, Value. So we have these emerging asynchronous communications, right? And that's how our rich applications are really evolving today. And then the piece de resistance, microservices, right? So microservices are the way that we are pulling apart our monolithic applications into little pieces that all have to orchestrate and work well together. These little pieces come from subdomains or superdomains, and then they communicate within those domains or maybe outside of those domains. And when you need to communicate outside of those domains, what do you need to use? CORES.
Guess you wonder where I've been.
If you've written client-side code in the past 10 years, then you know exactly how Cassidoo feels right here, or Cassidoo, however you pronounce her name. Great follow on Twitter. Developer, just a really, really amazing talent and also really funny. But this is a very real conversation, a very frequent conversation that Kevin and I have with developers all the time that are writing client-side code. Interesting thing about this is while CORS is here up on the video and CORS shows up in the errors within your browsers, cross-origin resource sharing, that's not actually the root of the problem that so many folks encounter when they're dealing with these types of applications. The real root of the problem is this thing called same origin policy. And I would hope that most folks in here or anybody dealing with web stuff has actually an understanding of same origin policy, or has at least dealt with it at some point in time, because it is a key security component built within our browsers. Okay, so what does it mean to be same origin? Well, it means that two things come from the same protocol, same host, and the same port. So if you look at these examples here, the second one would be not from the same origin because it's a different protocol. The third bullet here is not from the same origin as the first because it's a different host, right? Subdomain versus domain is seen as a different host. And then the third one because of it being on an alternate port. So anything coming from these two different places would be considered to be not in the same origin, and I'll talk about the implications of that here in just a moment. One of the interesting things about the topics that we're going to talk about today, same origin policy and CORS, is these are things that are enforced by the browser. Now in the security community, particularly the web security community, we always talk about real security happens on the server. Well, these are browser components. These things have to be enforced on that side of things. So it makes them kind of unique, and it begins to it will fry your mind trying to get your mind wrapped around how are we implementing security controls in a place where we actually don't even have the control because they belong to the attacker or the client or whoever. Right? But it is absolutely enforced by the browser. And same origin policy actually happens to be the reason why CSRF is even a thing. And I'll show you that here in just a moment. So here's same origin policy applied. So we'll say that this application here in the middle is landmaster53.com. Okay, my website. And we'll say that the third party here is Twitter. And basically what I want to do as the developer of landmaster53.com is I want to embed my Twitter feed into my website so that when you go there, you see a live feed going on there. Now in the past, we used to have to do this thing called, actually I'll get to that part here in just a moment. Okay, so what happens is you make a request to landmaster53.com. Landmaster53.com passes back some HTML, some style sheets, but it passes back some JavaScript as well. And what that JavaScript wants to do is it wants to make a request out to Twitter, pull down all of my public tweets, bring them back, and embed them in the website. And what same origin policy says, as you can see right here, is that it makes the request out, and when the data comes back, the browser says, hey, wait a second. The origin of this JavaScript is landmaster53.com, but you just made a request and this data came from twitter.com. You are not allowed to process it. And the browser is not allowed to embed that content within the current page at landmaster53.com. And I think some of you may be looking at me now going, but wait a second, we see this kind of stuff happen all the time. This is not something that I mean, if you've encountered the error, you kind of know, but those of you who just use the internet on a daily basis, you see things being brought, different technologies being brought together constantly, okay? And that's due to this thing called cross-origin resource sharing, because that same origin policy right there, that applies. That's the default state of all browsers. You're not allowed to do the kind of thing that we all see happen all of the time. And it's due to CORS. CORS, quite simply put, is a server-controlled mechanism to bypass same origin policy. CORS is not a security control. It's an anti-security control. It is used to disable the most important security control that we have on the browser, which is same origin policy. So let me just kind of throw that out there to start with, because that's a huge misconception that we deal with, okay? But what it does is ultimately it removes this need for server-side mashups. And I'll bump up a slide real quick just to show you this, because in order to do what I just talked about on the same origin policy side, blend Twitter stuff with Landmaster53 stuff, what we used to have to do is when you made a request over to Landmaster53.com, me as the developer of that application on the server side where there is no browser, so there is no same origin policy, right? On the server side, I could reach out to Twitter, and I could pull that data down, I could mash it together right there on the server, and then serve up HTML that has all of that stuff already put together. And those were called server-side mashups. But that's pretty resource intensive on the server, right? Having to make all those additional requests and dynamically put all that data together. It was very resource intensive, and we wanted to push it to the client, rightfully so, distribute that processing. Okay, and that's exactly what CORS does. So now, when you make a request to landmaster53.com and landmaster53.com responds with that JavaScript that wants to pull stuff back from Twitter, well, now Twitter has an opportunity to actually tell the browser that it's allowed to do that through this thing called CORS. So there's two different types of cross-origin requests. There's a simple cross-origin request, and we'll call a pre-flighted cross-origin request. It'll make more sense to pre-flighted here in just a moment. But basically, and it's pretty technical. You'd go into the RFC if you want to know really what constitutes the two. But at a very basic level, what separates simple and pre-flighted is a simple request is something that's not state-changing and doesn't require credentials. So something like reaching out to Twitter and pulling down a public Twitter feed. I'm not creating a tweet. It doesn't require credentials. It should be considered a safe cross-origin request. All right? Pre-flight is the exact opposite of that. I'll get back to that in a minute. Okay? So what if I do want to embed my tweets in landmaster53.com? You make a request, JavaScript comes down, JavaScript makes the request out to Twitter. Twitter responds back with this thing called an access control allow origin header. You see it right here. And as long as that access control allow origin header has a certain value in it that permits my origin, and he's going to talk about those values here in a moment, has those values that permits my origin to load the data, then the data that comes back with it will be loaded, the browser will be allowed to access it, and you'll see that content populate in the interface. Twitter used CORS to disable same origin policy in landmaster53.com. Okay? Disabled it. They removed the security control. So I want to make that clear. So now let's say I want to take it a little bit further. So rather than, you go to landmaster53.com, you read one of my epic articles because they're all amazing, okay? And you're like, I got to tweet this. Well, landmaster53.com is going to try to make that easy for you. And at the bottom of the blog, you see a little button that says, tweet this, okay? Well, now when you click on that, the browser says, hey, wait a second, this particular user is trying to make a cross-origin request from Landmaster53 over to Twitter, but now it's a post request. It's state changing because it wants to create data and it wants to do it on behalf of a current user using their active session. This is what we call a pre-flighted, because what the browser does before it even makes that request, it detects that you're trying to do something that's state changing and requires authentication. At that point in time, the browser says, wait a second, I need to make sure you're allowed to do this first. And so as you saw in simple, where it actually sends the request with the data and everything comes back before the decision's made, well, in a pre-flighted cross-origin request, it has to get permission and make the decision before it actually ever sends the request. And if any of you are like me and you surf the internet with the network tab open in your developer tools, you've seen these little options requests just go crazy in there. Well, what those options requests are, those are these things called the pre-flight requests. And so what's happening here is when landmaster53.com says, hey, Twitter, I want to create this tweet based on this particular user's session, Twitter says, the browser says, wait, got to ask permission first. Browser reaches out to Twitter and says, this person wants to do, this origin, landmaster53.com, wants to do this kind of behavior. Twitter has that opportunity at that point to say yes or no. If it says yes, then the actual post request goes across and comes back. If Twitter says no, then it doesn't. And that's how cross-origin resource sharing works when we're talking about complex things that are state changing and require credentials, okay?
So now that Tim has given you an overview of CORS and how it works, let's talk about some of the problems with CORS, because it is a security discontrol, a anti-security control. So, of course, coming with that, we're going to have some concerns above and beyond when we're talking about maybe some times when same origin policy shouldn't be disabled, right? So the problem statement, we need to get around same origin policy. So what are some core solutions to do that? Well, you can include a wildcard origin, which we'll go over here in a moment, or you can arbitrarily reflect an origin that's allowed to receive that. And we'll show that as well. So if you see in the example here, I'm a speaker, I'm coming from Hacker Tracker, and I want to do a post to check in to derbycon.com. So you can see here, post check-in, JSON data, content type, all that fun stuff. So the browser says, hey, he's going off domain. We need to do something first. We need to make sure that Kevin is allowed to do this. So the browser says, hey, pre-flight options, can Hacker Tracker post data to Derbycon? And the browser responds with, or the server, excuse me, responds with, okay. But what's missing there? It's missing the access control allow origin headers and all the course headers, really. There's nothing there. So nothing works, right? We get our CORS error. So this is, again, the same origin policy roadblock. This is the default function. If there isn't a shim or CORS to be able to do this, we have broken apps. If we have broken apps, businesses don't make money, the functionality is kind of important, and this exact problem statement, the CORS error bug, this is why we have insecure configurations, and those are what I'm going to talk about here in a moment. So we go back and we make some changes to that request. So options request goes out, can Hacker Tracker talk to derbycon.com, pre-flight request. This time, Derbycon responds with access control allow origin asterisk. So it's allowing any origin to talk to derbycon.com. So it works, right? Kind of. You would expect that if I'm checking in as a speaker, there would be some type of authentication involved with that, right? So it works, but we need to pass those some type of creds through. So the developer makes some more changes. So the server now says in that same pre-flight request, access control, allow origin, any origin, and we allow credentials to be passed over to that server. So now what happens? We get the same bug. And the reason for that is the wildcard origin. So the wildcard origin is kind of the new normal, it's the new normal state, and I'll go over that here more in a moment. It's considered safe because it doesn't allow authenticated requests to go through to any origin anywhere. And this is actually a security control applied at the browser level. The browsers look at that pre-flight response and say access control allow origin any, and access control allow credentials equals true. Whoa, that is way too dangerous. We cannot allow this to happen because any origin is allowed to make authenticated requests on behalf of, who knows, some poor user who probably wasn't actually requesting this, and it's going to send along their credentials with that, their cookies, right? So the developer makes some more changes. Here's your options. Hacker Tracker wants to post Derbycon. And the server says access control allow origin hackertracker.info, access control allow credentials equals true. And it works. We're happy. We go home. But someone points out that if you do somerandomorigin.com and you want to post to Derbycon, Derbycon also responds with somerandomorigin.com. So this is arbitrary origin reflection. And a side note here, Tim and I figured out last night that we may have, by mistake, coined the term arbitrary origin reflection. So James Kettle in his Burp blog post, he mentioned arbitrary origins in some manner, and Evan Johnson mentioned this problem in previous manners. We definitely didn't discover the problem by any means, but when you Google arbitrary origin reflection, Tim's commit to the tool that we're about to show you is the only thing that comes up on the internet. So we may have accidentally coined this bug class, but we didn't discover it. The arbitrary origin reflection was already out there. So arbitrary origin reflection. It's super bad. It reflects any origin you give it, and it sends along your cookies with it. It's pretty common, like default in a lot of libraries. These are just a few that Tim and I have worked with personally and have found that it either used to be this way or it still is today. Tim knows with Flasks, I know with GoChi, I've seen it in production, it will just reflect any origin you give it, and it will send along credentials. So I mentioned Evan before. He needs a lot of props. He's actually also referenced in the Burp Suite blog. Evan wrote the original research that I've ever seen regarding misconfigured cores. His blog post is there. He also scanned the Alexa top, I think it's 100,000, it might be million, and he looked for any sites in the Alexa X that did this by default, and they're all included there, at least a shot in time. At that time, all of them, all of the vulnerable hosts are included there. So go Evan, he's awesome. He actually also put a pull request in to fix GoChi cores, and almost kind of got into a little bit of a spat with the person because they didn't want to fix it, and he just ended the pull request with, open source is a hoot. And it's still vulnerable, and I found it on a client assessment completely a part of Evan's research. So it's out there, it's doing its thing. So let me pose a question. What's the difference between cross-site request forgery and Core's arbitrary reflected origin that sends cookies to a domain without the user really giving that permission to do so? Well, the answer here is it's actually worse. The attacker can see the response to that request. So CSurf is blind. CSurf, which I just read a blog, I think Scott Helm put one out like today or maybe a little bit ago. CSurf is dead. Same site cookies are now default. CSurf is dead. Well, this is not dead. And the attacker can see the response from the server. It's not blind. So some mitigations for arbitrary reflected origin. So you can whitelist origins, but it's painful. You have to do some programmatic way of grabbing on the fly, and then you can't make any mistakes, and you can't do a regex that has a loose capture on it. It's painful. You could avoid cookie-based authentication because this really only, the whole arbitrary reflected origin with the cookie thing, the access control allow credentials equals true, that only applies to cookies. So you could just avoid cookie-based authentication, but if anyone in here has seen Randall Deeg's talk from Okta, JWT suck, I don't necessarily say to just abandon cookies, because cookies have their place. They are really good. So you could do that. Or you could move to wildcard origin, right? Wildcard solves this problem. Wildcard isn't vulnerable. The browser says, hey, wildcard origin, access allow credentials equals true. No, we're not doing that. So there aren't any issues. It looks dangerous, but it's actually safe. But are there any edge cases to wildcard origin? We can send unauthenticated requests from any user to a vulnerable service and access the results. Think about that for a moment. Unauthenticated requests are probably not too dangerous. We can see the results. So I was thinking about that one day, and it just hit me. I was looking at the whiteboarding it out, and I said, wait, what attack is good from an unauthenticated standpoint? Oh, online brute force attacks, right? And I can get the resulting request. So I worked up a small POC. I thought I was crazy. I called Tim. Tim also thought I was crazy.
I still think he's crazy.
Still thinks I'm crazy. We play Who's on First every time we talk about cores. And I'll let Tim talk about what he created from this one little conversation over a year ago.
Yeah, so before I step into this, I realized when Kevin was talking something I forgot to mention, and that was kind of like the whole reason why same origin policy even exists, okay? And what reminded me was when you said that you can access the response on the client. So let's think about same origin policy, let's think about a cross-site scripting attack, or even just malicious JavaScript that's sitting in landmaster53.com. If that JavaScript wants to like reach across to your bank or something and pull back information, it cannot access it. Same origin policy blocks it. That prevents things like cross-site scripting attacks from stealing data from any website that you have a session with, right? It's a good thing. It's supposed to be there. But the fact that it's on the server, I mean, the fact that the same origin policy is applied on the browser and it blocks that retrieval and access of the information on the way back, that's why CSRF is actually a class of attack, because like he said, it's blind. It's that first half of the relationship before same origin policy does anything. The attack still goes out. We can change something using your session, but we really can't access the response because same origin policy blocks it, okay? So CSRF really is born out of the fact that SOP prevents catastrophic cross-site scripting issues. And so now when you think about cores disabling SOP, CSRF is kind of like, who freaking cares? I don't even care if I can actually set something. I'm stealing all your stuff. Right? I'm just going to send requests to anything you have an active session with, and then I can access that response and just send it over to a server that I control and steal your data, okay? So I wanted to go back and make sure I made that really, really clear. So yeah, Kevin reached out to me and he mentioned it to me. We went back and forth for a couple of days on this, and then when I finally began to see like the light that he was trying to show me, anybody that knows me knows that I absolutely love to write code, and I'm forever looking for an excuse to do so. And so I had a POC written in about like 6 hours. I was like, I want to do this. And so I threw it together. I want you to keep in mind, this is just a proof of concept. I've got a lot of open source projects that I maintain, and so I just want to make it clear that I have no intent to maintain this, okay? So, like, don't send, I mean, if you want to send me emails, that's fine, but like, I'm not going to like support a bunch of issues on it, and I'm not going to like have a wiki and all that, or update documentation. You feel free to go ahead and use it, and also feel free to go ahead and fork it and do whatever you want with it. I personally don't intend to maintain it. Did you have something you want to add?
The only difference here is we're telling you up front we're not going to maintain it versus every other security tool that comes out where you just like, is this person ever going to do anything with it? Right up front, we're not going to do anything more with it. It's done.
No. Because it's really a bad thing. Like I'm an unabashed white hat. I got no business in that community, but there's no real good reason to use a tool like this, and so for that in that regard, I have no reason to maintain it. Okay, so basically what it does is it exploits this like default wildcard, because I can't remember if you mentioned it, but there are a lot of frameworks that when you install the cores extension, it's just arbitrary reflected origin by default, which is the worst case scenario. Those that have started to try to do the right thing now default to wildcard, okay? And so wildcard, if we can do arbitrary, then this works even better. If all we have is wildcard, well, then we're stuck with these unauthenticated ones, and we still have some use cases that we can do. But regardless, it exploits these permissive course policies, and every single implementation we've seen is vulnerable to this, okay? So it basically uses a distributed attack infrastructure, and that's where you guys come in, okay? So we got 3 different pieces to this. I've got a target application, Juice Shop, which is a client-side rendered application running on Heroku. And then I've got a command and control server that's going to be running in Google Cloud. And then I've got a DigitalOcean box that's essentially our third party that's hosting the malicious payload. Now, I want you to think of that third party hosting the malicious payload as it being, it could be tainted JavaScript. It could be somebody's MySpace page with like HTML embedded in it. It could be a cross-site scripting attack anywhere. It could be landmaster53.com, and I just chose to like joke around with all of you. It could be anywhere JavaScript is running. So I just want you to kind of look at it that way. Okay, so it can be deployed in a bunch of different ways, and ultimately I think it's a beef module just waiting to happen for those of you that are familiar with the browser exploitation framework, okay? So this is the URL to that page. I'm gonna make sure everything is still up here and running. Okay, that's still running. My dashboard is also still running, okay? So what I want you to do is go ahead, and if you've got a phone, phones work for this too. If you've got a phone, you've got a computer, you want to participate, go ahead and go to this particular link here, and what your system is going to do, it's going to subscribe to a server-sent event source. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin pushing payloads down to all of your devices, and your devices are going to begin to conduct a distributed authentication attack against the JuShop authentication page, okay? So hugely distributed attack against that, all using the fact that JuShop has a cross origin or allow access control origin wildcard. Okay, so now everybody's in there, right? You should be subscribed, and if you want to, if you're using a browser, go ahead and open up the developer tools and watch the network side of this. I'll go ahead and get mine doing this as well so that we can actually see it happen. Wow, you guys are hammering it right now. I can't even get to it. You warned me of this, Kevin. Is anybody's not working? Are some people subscribed? There we go. Okay. So now I'm subscribed to it. I'm going to go up here and I'm going to run an attack. So we're going to run the JuShop attack. We'll use the large credential list and I'm going to run it. Oh my goodness, that went. Here we go. It should jump up to a couple thousand. There we go. That's the red. Dang, you guys cracked it already.
It's jumping about 500 requests a second.
500 requests every few seconds. Now keep in mind here, I have this throttled so that we can actually watch it, okay? So when I had this running at full speed, it was happening so fast that we couldn't actually show you what it looked like. But so I have every single request that's going to the command and control server throttled by 1/4 of a second. Every one. So you would actually be moving much, much faster if it wasn't. And you see my browser here just hammering away at the JuShop authentication page. That Heroku server is probably also only running on a single thread, which means that if it was multi-threaded in a production environment like normal, we would be completely obliterating this thing. Our command and control is actually running at 10 threads, so it's handling a little bit more. But if you look what's being transferred here, it's about 200 kilobytes a request, which is very small. So the footprint of this kind of attack is obviously going to be dictated by the payload that we're running against the particular vulnerable resource. But regardless, it's a small payload, it's distributed, it runs very, very fast, and as you can see, we're already done. We ran through those 7,000 keys really, really quick, and we've cracked 2 different sets of credentials here, okay? So that's just a proof of concept. Like, it's interesting because as we were reading through James Kettle's article where he talks about some Bitcoin, I guess some Bitcoin sites that were vulnerable to arbitrary reflected origin and how he got some bounties paid in that, he literally mentions the fact that if there's not an authenticated context to it, then really there's no dangerous implications to it. When the reality is things like this, you could call it an edge case, but it's really common. We find these types of authentication APIs that are serving up wildcard origins all the time. These are all vulnerable to distributed attacks just like this. Okay.
So a little bit more mitigation. So we talked about arbitrary reflected origin. There's some mitigation there. When it comes to wildcard origin, you can use a synchronized token pattern. So this is basically your anti-CSRF control. I'll caution you on that because I don't know the last time I saw an anti-CSRF control on an unauthenticated page that was actually enforced. So it's conceptually you could do it, but it's not really done out there in the wild very often. There's also one missing here. I think I mentioned it earlier, excuse me. It was not using a wildcard origin, not using an arbitrary reflected origin, but to hard code the origins that should be able to be speaking to your site, right? That has some implications. It's definitely not easy to do. There's a lot of hacks. There's the whole regex thing where you could miss a closure and then you could have, ceph.derbycon.rip.kcody.co. And if you miss that extra closure, now you're just opening yourself up for additional attacks and whatnot.
Basically a rebirth of refer checking type stuff.
Exactly. So just some final thoughts as we're wrapping up here. Bad recommendations are everywhere when it comes to cores. Specifically, how many out here either have in your environment or have used with other people's environments Swagger? Swagger? Okay, good. Yeah, it's pretty common, you know. A lot of self-documenting API frameworks like Swagger are actually, believe it or not, the cause of this issue. I've actually tested clients multiple times where I've seen CORS only enabled. The only reason CORS is even on is to allow Swagger to work. Because Swagger is usually hosted on another port or a subdomain or in another host. And literally, these apps don't even want to use CORS, but they go out to Swagger. They're like, yeah, we're gonna do the Swagger thing. We're gonna do, oh, I got to turn CORS on. Okay, well, let's just make sure it works. Let's go through, and all of a sudden, you've opened yourself up to maybe reflected origin, maybe wildcard origin, right? It's crazy. And on Swagger's site, they actually recommend this enablecors.org site, which helps you. I mean, there's like 15 different frameworks where it actually shows you this is how you enable CORS on XYZ. And every single one of them either recommends wildcard or arbitrary reflected origin. Every one of them. So bad advice is everywhere. And then again, the default state of said extensions or libraries are either wildcard, which is better than not, but it's, again, not great, what we showed you today, or reflected origin, which is really, really, really bad. None of them that we've seen ship with default good configs. There might be some Stack Overflow security posts out there that say, hey, you should probably do it this way, and you can copy that and feed it into whatnot. But none of them actually out of the box ship with anything other than wildcard, because again, what are you trying to do? You're just trying to make cross-origin work, right? This bug, Cassie-Doo's bug, is popping up on your developer tools in that yellow thing that says, we've blocked this cross-origin request because it's really dangerous. So you're just trying to get that thing to work. And sadly, it might be because you're trying to get Swagger working. So yeah, wildcard origins without credentials can be dangerous. We just showed you that today. I hope the demo was pretty cool. And yeah, CORS is just still widely misunderstood. And I'll leave Tim with the last thought.
So drink this in for a second. Okay, this is CORS this is Swagger's documentation page right here. All right. The first sentence says, CORS is a technique to prevent websites from doing bad things to your personal data. Folks, CORS is a technique to allow websites to do bad things to your data, okay? This is 100% wrong. Like, there's just no other way to put it. And if you follow this thread right on down, this is the Swagger's implementation guidance that's live today. You can go to this website. Right now, it literally points you over to the enablecors.org, which tells you how to do this the vulnerable way across any framework you could possibly imagine. Now, do I think they want you to be broken on purpose? No, I think based on that sentence right there, they just don't fully understand it. They just don't fully get what CORS is. And so I hope today we've been able to kind of demystify that a little bit for some folks that are in the room, at least make some awareness of this. I mean, if you're on the development side, now you got a better understanding of CORS is. If you're on the security side, you need to be looking for this. When Burp says there's a reflected origin, pay attention. It means something. It means that that particular application is vulnerable to catastrophic cross-site scripting attacks from anywhere, or catastrophic attacks from anywhere on the internet. Okay. So as far as the goods go, it's eventually going to be here. I don't have it open right now. It is a private repository, but I will be pushing it out there. So go ahead and mark that. I will probably, that will be the only link that you actually need, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to export this to PDF and then throw it up in the repo as well. So you'll be able to go there. If you want to see the code is there, and you'll be, all my credentials are hard coded, so you'll get to see all that kind of stuff, my password that I keep and everything. So you'll have that, and then you'll have the PDF there as well, and then some other resources. There's Kevin and my website. But other than that, how are we doing on time? It looks like we got about 10 more minutes. If anybody's got any questions, go ahead and bring them forward. Anybody? Yes, sir.
I was curious, would you say it's the server that you're attacking isn't the server's responsibility to start crawling those failed password attempts? Because I think you probably still perform this attack without using CORS, right?
You would be able to. Yes, I will. So the question was, isn't it on the server to prevent an automated attack against this? And I think you mentioned that the attack could still be conducted without CORS. Without CORS, the only way to conduct that attack is from the actual app itself. You wouldn't be able to do it in the distributed nature in which we did it. And so you're absolutely right in that the server should be implemented implementing some sort of anti-automation control there. But if that anti-automation control is based on IP address or based on some sort of fingerprint or some sort of origin, the distributed nature within which we are making that attack will confuse that. It will have to try to throttle all of these different sources, and as those sources ramp up, we just had probably a couple of dozen in here, but if I've got a botnet of thousands across, or tens of thousands across the globe, it's going to be something that gets very, very tricky for them very, very quickly. Yeah, I mean, and you could still conceivably conduct that attack, but it would be very slow and very easy to block. It's the distributed nature allowed by that permissive course policy that allows this to be more dangerous than that. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah, so the question was, will I describe my infrastructure again? So basically what we have right here is we've got a target application, which if for those of us in here that are pen testers, it would be our target, our scoped application, which is Juice Shop running up on Heroku. Okay, and then I've got my command and control server, and it's running on Google Cloud. I'm just using free tier like F1 Microbox, and I've just got this thing up and running on it there. And that's written in Python Flask with a Vue.js front end. And then the just anywhere on the internet application that is serving up that particular payload, right now it's just a really simple HTML file. Those of you that have pulled it down, you can continue to look at that. I'll take it offline later. But it's just a simple HTML file that subscribes to an event source at the command and control server. That command and control server pushes down JavaScript and then pushes down payloads that basically tell all the subscribers to go attack this particular authentication page. And even though it's coming from Derbycon.RIP, because it's allowed to make cross-origin requests based on Juice Shop's configuration, that allows the attack to take place from pretty much anywhere on the globe, anywhere on the internet.
And I don't think Tim mentioned, you can also load credentials asynchronously as well. So he actually showed when he loaded the credentials, the large credential list, you could just keep piping those in, changing those.
Yeah, I'm using a Redis queue on the back end. So I'm using a Redis queue for that on the back end. Is if you're subscribed, it was funny because we still have no idea what's actually happening with this. But when I was pumping, there was none of us. We were testing it about an hour ago. Neither of us thought we were subscribed to anything. I started pumping creds into the Redis server, and all of a sudden it just started going down. His phone was still attacking it from last night on a browser tab that he thought he closed, and it was in his pocket. It was still subscribed, just waiting. So it's one of those things where if you subscribe to it on your phone, you're still subscribed to it right now. You'll need to actually close the tab for that to go away. So it's wickedly persistent in that regard as well.
And in case you didn't see it when you pointed it out, it was 800 requests, and he hadn't hit a megabyte of data transferred from him. And there's no way, if this was embedded in any type of big site, any type of ad network, any type of site that you weren't already kind of, I don't know what's going on here, that you would ever catch this unless you were looking at a proxy or Splunk logs or something like that.
Does that answer your question? Great. Yes? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. The purpose of the command and control server, basically to feed the attack information down to the distributed client. So I had to tell all of your browsers which website to go attack and how to actually send the payload to it, right? So I didn't really show it, but I can. Real quick, we've got still 5 more minutes. We got 5 more minutes? Yeah, we got 5 more minutes. Here in the command and control server, you can add an attack. And so this is where you would come and you would actually build the information about the request that's going to be made to the actual target application. So that's what it's needed, basically just to tell all the different bots what they need to do. And receive the responses, obviously, because this is where the credentials populated down here.
And that's the magic, right? You can see, once it succeeded, which creds were tried. And that's how you know that it worked. And that wouldn't work in CSRF. And wouldn't work with any other technology except for Course.
Yeah. Any other questions? I got a couple in the back, on the left-hand side first.
So if you got a website with, say, 30 pages, account balance, change passwords, but only one page of that, like the About Us page, returns the access control headers, can you exploit that one page to get the data from the other page?
Well, if it doesn't have any useful functionality, then there wouldn't be anything we could do to it. But Kevin, do you have something you want to respond?
Sorry, I was just telling him to repeat the question. So the question was, if you have a brochureware page, unauthenticated page that's just an account, just about us or contact us or whatever, it doesn't have any way of really invoking anything bad. But there's other pages that are authenticated or that are a login page from an unauthenticated standpoint that could be used in a bad way. Can we pivot or do something from the one page to the other page? And the answer is no. You could still try to launch a weak, like, distributed denial of service attack against that about us, which would probably be nil. But unless there was some other additional attack vector that you could pivot through, like SSRF or something like that on that specific page, this is very important. Every page returns access control allow whatever headers back. So every single request goes out, looks at that, and then you can then make a CORS request back to it.
I think some other likely candidates for this would be things like user enumeration vulnerabilities, things that would exist from an unauthenticated perspective, like the About page, but the About page doesn't really have any, it's static, right? So we're looking for dynamic pages that are unauthenticated would be ideal candidates for stuff like this. And one more in the back. Okay, so his question was, so Swagger wants you to set up things the bad way. What's the right way? Whitelisting. Yeah. I think whitelisting is the proper way to do this. And like Kevin said, one of the really interesting things about this was that these applications aren't even doing anything cross-origin, and the only reason that they're putting cross-origin headers there is to support Swagger. And so their whitelist would be very small. We're talking a configuration file with maybe one or two origins listed in there. And so and then that's the incredible thing about this, these extensions that you install, like Flask CORS, for instance, if you just say install Flask CORS, which is what Stack Overflow tells every Python developer to do, it's vulnerable. Arbitrary reflected origin right off the bat. But if you go in and just add a configuration variable with a list of origins, it automatically applies the whitelist. So it's very easy to do it right. There's just so much bad guidance out there telling folks how to do it wrong. But yes, whitelisting is the right answer.
It is also unwieldy if you have a lot of origin domains. It is unwieldy, and that's just, it comes down to the spec, the RFC. It just wasn't really made to support a large, kind of dynamically. Obviously, if it's dynamic, then it opens you up for arbitrary origin reflection. So
I'll actually take these last 2 minutes to make an interesting point about the spec with regards to how it's actually been implemented. Is the spec says to support multiple origins, what you're supposed to do is respond with a comma delimited list of origins within the actual header response, okay? Two problems with that. That could end up being a really, really big response header. Number two, how many of us actually want to disclose every single person that's allowed to access our API within a response header that anyone can access, right? It doesn't make any sense. You said it was the new robots.txt, right? So that header, and so the browsers actually don't even support it. If you try to send that back, the browsers won't even obey it. It doesn't even work. So they just flat out not supported that part of the spec.